Welcome everybody at home and in the room today to our winter coffee talk at York Preparatory Academy. We do these coffee talks 3 times a year to help provide community education on relevant topics that affect students today. We're very happy to welcome our middle school guidance counselor, Ms. Ashley Brown, who's going to talk to us about the connection crisis and give us some more information about helping students have authentic connections at their home and in their relationships. Thank you, Ms. Brown.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about this today because, as Ms. Bruner said, we've talked to teachers and we've talked to parents, and we're seeing so many changes with our students today and the issues they're dealing with. And clearly we think about school as the place where we learn, education and academic things, which is very important. But we're also noticing a shift with students that there's a deficit in some of the social emotional areas where we really need those strengths to be. And so we're targeting that as a school, but also at home. It's such a huge thing that you can start doing some things to help your child be more connected to others authentically, because we're living in a world that is more connected than ever before, but it's not necessarily true connections. We're not necessarily being real with people and being vulnerable and authentic. And so that starts at home with our families. We can teach that and grow that with our students on how to do that well if we're intentional about it. If we're not intentional, it doesn't happen, speaking as a parent. If we're not intentional, life gets busy. We get going, work, school, homework, all the things, devices get in the way. But we really want to be intentional about this, and I'll explain a little bit more about why. So I talked a little bit about what I've seen, but what have you guys seen change with students and kids in recent years?
Attention spans, they have drastically been reduced.
Absolutely. Shorter attention spans.
It's all about the instant gratification of the social media and the games and all that kind of stuff in the electronics, and that's carried over into the classroom where they're expecting to either know the answer or be given the answer. They don't expect to have to actually work for it.
I think less human interaction.
Yeah. So then we see that come up at school when the conflicts arise and they shut down and don't know how to deal with it sometimes.
Or just the ability of, if a student has a phone and we have to take it. Just the reaction to
the end of the world
phone versus any other option.
True anxiety comes out of that sometimes.
And I was going to say anxiety, just students not knowing how to work through conflicts. Like conflict resolution or working with difficult people, or maybe a teacher or somebody they don't necessarily click with. How do they work through those situations? They don't necessarily have the tools as much.
And I'm not trying to be humorous, but as a lay minister, it's funny. It's like the kids don't seem to be as romantically interested in one another. Like, I think when I was growing up as a teenager, there was a lot more interest between boys and girls. And teenagers nowadays, it's like, boys, I'm like, aren't you interested in these girls? But, they go and play video games and sometimes get that reward.
Well, that's an interesting topic that I've talked about with some of my friends who aren't married and whatnot. It's a lot easier online to connect with people, so you don't have to show a lot of effort sometimes. That could be it, that I don't need to show effort here in person because I'll talk to them later via text, and it's less threatening to do it behind a computer, so that could be it too, that they're doing it in other ways that don't show the interest overtly. That's interesting. So you guys named it, but one thing we didn't name, childhood obesity is on the rise, and a lot of that is that lack of activity. We're trading off activity and doing different active things for electronics, and that's for adults too, if we're being honest, that we're more sedentary, we're doing these things. But yes, depression is a big part, ADHD, anxiety, that's on the rise across the board. And a lot of it links back to when we saw this surge in fake interactions and less of the real interactions is really the connection I see. Anybody ever had that moment? Like, you're done with the device tonight.
That's right.
Yeah. The bottom. So I think that's a big reason why. So the end goal for our kids is that social emotional wholeness, and really the thing that we're going to talk about is resiliency. Building resiliency, and that's the ability to recover when things are hard, the ability to deal with things when they're difficult, and that is what they need to be successful. So the survey in front of you is a screener that is really just intended to teach parents more about resiliency. It's made in connection with the ACEs study. Has anybody ever heard of the ACEs study? Adverse Childhood Experiences. And that really measures trauma that children experience or that adults have experienced as a child. And there's a lot of indications that if children or adults have high ACEs scores, they're less likely to be as successful. There's more that come at them, and there's more barriers in life, including health and things like that. Now, another study was done in connection to that ACEs that talked about resiliency. And it talked about even if you have a high ACEs score, even if there's been trauma in your life, if you have a high resiliency score, you are more likely to overcome those difficulties. And so we can't always control what happens to us. We certainly can't control what happens to our kids. But we can control this resiliency factor to some degree. And that's the hope that I have as a parent and as an educator and as a counselor, is that we have an impact on this. So I'll let you guys complete that.
We will post, and we can post these links.
Yes, we'll post these online for anybody. So as we look at this, the more definitely truths and probably truths that you have on this screener, the more resilient you are likely to be. What do you notice as themes on this screener that make you resilient?
Family support.
Family support, yes. There's a lot in here about family and support. Mm-hmm. And accountability, I would say, too. There's rules, there's expectations put forth for you. Sometimes when our kids go through difficult experiences that are out of their control, be it something extreme like abuse or trauma, or even, divorce situations or difficulties at home, the tendency is, let's make it easier for them. But what actually is shown is not just to make it easier. Yes, provide that support for those difficult things, but provide accountability and rules and structure and expectations. That is what causes the resiliency through the hard things. So it's really the opposite of what our gut says to do in that moment when our kids experience hard things. But yes, you're exactly right. That connection and that family piece, that's why it's so important that we create these authentically. So, I liked this little thing poking up through the ground. It's the ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. How do our kids do with that overall right now, do you think? As a whole society.
Not good. Yeah.
It's a decline.
Right.
So that is why we don't have to be part of that statistic. We can really be intentional with our kids to make them more resilient for the long term. So we need to foster those connections, as you guys said, the family, the support, the people outside of the family that are positive, safe supports. Kids need to see that we value real-life relationships over the online ones. That doesn't just come from what we force them to do, which is going to be part of this, making them uncomfortable with forcing real-life relationships sometimes. But what do we do to show that we value real-life relationships? Some questions to think about as we reflect as parents. How much time do we allow online versus in person? And I say allow because you have control over that. You can choose how much we're allowing. That's really hard to do in a world where their assignments are online. I know that comes from us. But being intentional about what we allow and restrict some of those things if we can. How much time do we personally spend online versus in person? It's so easy to zone out. We all have stressful days and different things and expectations. By the end of the day, sometimes it's really easy to sit there with your phone and scroll through and look at different things and zone out. And your kids want to do that too. It's just a natural inclination. But I've definitely had my kid call me out like, Mom, are you listening? I'm like, oh. What we model and how we spend our time is so important for them to see that we're really being intentional about scheduling in-person things, talking to people physically on the phone as opposed to just texting all the time. Again, in a very fast-paced world, that's hard to do. But we have to be intentional or it's not going to happen. So the things that we talked about here, there's 4 different areas in the research that I did for this that people really say kids need to be connected to be successful on the whole as a holistic, successful child. They need to connect to their peers. which is knowing how to navigate conflicts and things like that. I just had a lesson this week with 6th graders about drama and navigating conflict. And one of the things I asked was, what is drama? And they were talking about it. And they would say, it's when you get in a fight with your friend. Not necessarily. Can you have conflict in a relationship and be successful? And they thought about it, and some of them were like, I guess so. Like, their initial response is no. You can't have conflict. But conflict comes with relationships. But navigating that conflict and then thinking through, when you've navigated that conflict with a friend the right way instead of drama where you bring other people into it, if you've done it face to face with that person, what happens after the conflict when you've solved it? And they're like, well, we're better. We're stronger. Our friendship's better. We're stronger friends. That is huge for them to figure out how to navigate. Now, we're here. I attached a previous one at the end that I've done on self-advocacy, but we're here as the coach. That's the theme of that one. We coach them through the conflict in their relationships, but it's more about what they're doing, not what we're doing for them. So connection to their peers, connection with their families, working through conflict with their families, not always us intervening with their brothers or sisters or things like that. Spending time feeling bonded with their families. That's really huge. I have a lot of kids who will say to me, I just wish I had some time to spend alone with my mom or dad. And that's like gut-wrenching as a parent. But it's so huge. They crave that time even if they don't act like it. I work with middle schoolers, even if they don't act like it, because they don't always act like it at that age. Nature is a big one that we've disconnected from, and I'm not a nature girl, but just getting outside, doing things physical. I would add, instead of just nature, it's just physical activity and intentionally being active. Society, learning how to appropriately connect with the world around them. I don't think growing up I had to connect with society completely as much as our kids are it's thrown in their face right now. You know what I mean? We really had our families, maybe our church group or things like that, our school, but we didn't have society as a whole. And I think it's so much more prevalent now. So we have to teach them to connect in these different areas. The biggest thing is that social emotional health. And here's the different areas. And they added these 5 areas, but I really connected it to the connections that they have for us, because it's all about connections. This is what we're working on. Some of you may have heard, K through 8, we're doing a program called Second Step. And that is an amazing program to focus on social emotional learning. I'll be honest, some students, especially in middle school, aren't always comfortable with it because it's focusing not on what they're used to in the classroom, which is academics and here's a problem and I write it out and that there's a specific answer. There's not a specific answer to social emotional things, so some of our students are uncomfortable with that. But they're working on relationship building, conflict management, things like that. You'll see the different messages that go home if you have a middle school student that say what they're learning so that you can continue that learning at home. And that's why we're focusing on it. The things, we want them to be able to connect to themselves, and that comes with that coaching piece as parents. We want them to have a self-awareness, to understand what's going on inside of me and stop and wait before I react instead of just, that impulsive behavior that we see so much. Learning how that self-awareness, self-management. I can manage myself. I can calm down when I'm upset. I can stay calm when I'm really excited. I can do different things and manage myself. We want to teach them responsible decision making. That's a hard one. How do you guys teach your kids responsible decision making?
Consequences.
Yeah. Say it again, William.
Consequences.
Yeah. Consequences.
And that's hard to do because you're like, ooh, that's not going to end well.
Yeah.
But you got to sit back and let them kind of reap the rewards or the consequences of it.
Yeah. Sometimes I think mine's evolved too over time. Like when they were little, I would make that decision more for them, where I'm saying, you're not going to do this because this is what, and if you do choose to do it, this is going to be the consequence of that decision or whatever. And now, as my kids are getting older and in high school, I'm trying to walk them through and say, okay, well, this is probably what's going to happen if you choose that. Now, if you choose to walk down that path, let's see what, you know what I mean? If you say this to a friend, this is probably how they're going to react. But
And that
you can choose to say that to a friend.
Yeah,
you know?
and I think about teenage boys, I was a scoutmaster, and I just remember boys showing up ill-equipped, and I would have to evaluate, like, are they going to die? No. Are they going to be miserable? Yes. Okay, let's go.
Exactly.
Because you counsel them, you're like, you need to bring this and this, and they don't, and so you're like, okay,
And I
reap the
think you
benefits.
can also help them think through the process. I think thinking about the consequences ahead is one of the hardest humps to get over, especially in the middle school ages. And so instead of saying, here's what I think is going to happen, to say, what do you think the possible outcomes
Right.
of these
I like
things
that.
are, and get them to think about the future of their decision, and just to understand that there is a future
Yes.
potential consequence to everything you
That's
do.
huge.
I think it goes from being it transforms over time, like a fifth grader, like out of middle school. So fifth grade versus eighth grade, there's situations that come up. For younger kids, like in fifth and sixth, it's more, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And then you're putting it on yourself to make sure that if they do that, then you make sure that consequence
Yes.
gets put in place,
Right.
which I think
Being
is a step that gets
consistent.
missed a lot of times. I feel like we live in a society where we give everybody 500 chances, and we don't ever say, and kids don't respect that. What they will respect is if you say, hey, if you make this mistake, this is what's going to happen if you do it again, because it doesn't ever correct the mistake if you don't enforce the consequence.
Right.
By eighth grade, you want them to, like what Debbie said, is you want them to be a self-advocate and understand, I know if I make this choice, this is what's going to happen, because they taught me that back in, when I was 10 and 11.
Yeah.
I think that goes with parenting at home too. Kids who struggle in school a lot of times, I feel like these days, the world we live in, there's a lot of negotiation. And
Yeah.
I think that, part of something that I think if we could change the narrative of how to improve connections, it would be, hey, you're still a child, we don't negotiate. This is what, you lead them down that road.
Right.
And you brought up a really good point. Like, improving that connection doesn't always mean that they like us.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
There's a bigger connection with true respect, and I'm a parent. That is the worst thing when this hurts them, that they're losing this privilege or whatever it is. But you have to do that sometimes, because otherwise it's not an authentic connection. It's them kind of walking all over the parent, and that's not a real relationship or one that we want them to have in their future life.
A story that really blew my mind about Serena and Venus Williams. They were little girls and stars on the tennis team. And part of their responsibility was to bring their gear. And they didn't. One of them did not bring their gear. And the coaches, the people at the team were like, let's go get them and this. And the dad said, no, they're going to sit out. Because I believe he was their coach to begin with and everything. And it said that changed their perspective. They became responsible because they missed the game. But how many of us would not allow our star player to play? Because they didn't sit up or they didn't. We'll
That's
get
huge.
someone's uniform and put it on that star player, and it's wrong because we're setting them up for for a disaster in the future, because that's not how it works at work, in the boardroom, wherever you are. You have to be prepared.
I saw this week. 6th grade, you may know, had a catapult project that they did. Do you know how many parents came in with catapult projects yesterday? No offense if you're watching this parent, but the temptation, there were so many, so I'm not talking about one.
Yeah.
There were so many, and one student went up to call and said, I forgot my project, and I jokingly said to the student, I hope your mom's nicer than me, because I would say, tough luck. And people will judge for that, not going to lie. They'll be like, you're so mean to your child that you wouldn't do that.
Right.
I'm a tough mom, sorry.
What you said is a reality because, for example, my 6 years old, when I get a phone call from Mr. Bridges, I'm like, oh, what has Spencer been up to? Mr. Bridges knows me. I'm like, oh.
That never happened.
So that, like many times, he is zoned out and then, he forget his lunchbox, for example, right? I mean, yes, I will be judged if I do not deliver lunchbox to my son. That serious consequence that has to happen, Mr. Bridges said earlier, too much negotiation, right? So how do we balance that, right? Growing up for me is that, it was a lot of obedience. We have to obedience our grown-up adults, and then it's about a lot of threats.
Yeah.
Which is not healthy either.
No. I think
not
it's a
healthy.
balance
We have
of
to.
the consequences in a loving way, but also
Yes.
what you two were saying is talking through, okay,
Yes.
what do I do next time? Because that's probably not what happened as much growing up. That was not the mode of parenting 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
But now it's much more, not the negotiation, but you have this consequence. What are you going to do differently? To put the onus on them for the decision making, because it's not on me. You can't be mad at me. You made the choice, you know?
I think one of the things too, that kids actually work things out too and figure, like, we have a child who sometimes can just be, not mindful and can walk off and leave his lunch. And, my wife and I sit there at home thinking, oh, it's going to be a great learning, he's going to school, we're not taking lunch to him. And then we get home and we're like, hey, what'd you do about lunch today? Like, oh, I just borrowed food from my friends. I was expecting this learning experience,
Right.
but it wasn't. So kids sometimes will have experiences and will think that there's going to be a challenge, but they'll a lot of times just work things out on their own and figure it out.
Exactly. Because you're building resiliency.
Which is
Which is perfect, right?
Yeah,
Right.
that is resiliency, is them being able to make the decisions and figure it out for themselves is really what we want. Because we can't have a bunch of people going off to college without the ability to make decisions. And God forbid, in the workplace.
And going along with that, we also, as they're growing up, need to limit the choices that they make as far as the extracurricular activities or just different things. I mean, they want to do so much. And you do X, Y, and Z. Okay, fine. That's 3 things. You've chosen those 3 things. Great. Now you want to do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. You're going to be burning the candle at both ends and get burned in the middle because you're going in so many different directions and you can't give 100% to every single thing that you're doing. Something is going to suffer, whether it's your health, whether it's your mental health, whether it's your physical health, whether it's your grades, whether it's whatever it is.
Well, and we know as adults that the more we're stretched thin, the less connection we really have when we're at those places. So that's limiting their connections. Like, more is not always better. So having true, 1 or 2 commitments, that's so hard to say because there's so many things. That is huge to help your child temper the excitement of all the things and know the balance. We're going to talk more about balance, but also the connection to others starts with ourselves, but relationship skills, social awareness, like really understanding how somebody else feels. I talked with 8th grade yesterday about empathy, and not just sympathy and feeling bad for somebody, but empathy and truly understanding how somebody else feels, even if they're different from me. And wouldn't our world be a better place if we can teach these kids empathy? So that's your job as parents, to instill that in them. And the more we do that, the stronger the connections become, because they're looking for, how can I connect to others? How can I understand how somebody else feels? But really that starts with what we model and showing how we're helping others, how we're looking for somebody who's different from us. Talking at the dinner table about, at work today, somebody felt left out. I know they did. Because that happens as adults. And what did we do to help with that? So sometimes those things are really huge. There's so many benefits for our children, and it's really the decrease in all those negative things and the increase in that self-awareness, self-acceptance, self-efficacy. Do you all know self-efficacy? Like, that's the ability to believe that I can do something hard. That's huge. That's more than self-confidence to me. Because I think it's really like we said before, kids shut down when it feels hard or I don't know the answer, especially our smartest kids. They're used to the answers come easily to me. I know this stuff. But when it gets hard and we challenge them, the shutdown happens. So we really want to build that. And that ultimately means they're empowered to do things on their own and figure things out when things are hard. They're empowered to have that future success that we all want for them. So what ideas do you guys have for fostering these connections with our kids?
I think that when you can, talk through a situation with your kids as to why you're making that decision, to promote or to have as many of those opportunities as possible, as opposed to, you can't do this because I said so, kind of scenario. Say, these is not the thought process, giving them the big picture as to why you're making that decision, I think can give you a connection with your child, and then allow them to connect to other people.
For me, like the thing that would help schools the most is the more authentic connections that students have outside of the school setting, from the home environment to the extracurricular environment, to coaches. All of that fosters into a classroom setting with more authentic connections.
Yeah.
It's easy for me to say as a parent and a principal, put the phone down. But the reality of that is that in order for us to be able to foster better positive connections, kids need to actually have modeling of positive connections. And we're very easy these days to let them just go off into their room or to a bonus room and let them play their video games, which doesn't foster positive connections or authentic connections. And then when they come to school and they struggle, we raise our hand and go, well, wait, what's wrong with my child? Because education is all about fostering authentic connections, whether that be from student to student, from teacher to student, from teacher to home. Those are things that basically schools are, how children act in school is a reflection of how they act outside of school a lot of times, whether we know it or not.
Well, and maybe it's just me, but I'm an extrovert and very social during my whole day. I spend my entire day talking to people. By the end of the day, I don't want to go anywhere or talk to anyone. That's real. 100%. But my kids need that. And sometimes it is like, oh, I don't want to go do something. I just want to veg out. But there's no time for that either. You just have to be intentional about really putting it out there, talking to other parents, getting kids together, being on the teams, like you said. Even if the team's not good, our hardest year was when my son was on a team that lost every game. And he wanted to quit so bad. And I'm like, no, but they built relationships and they got stronger together through that process.
Yeah.
For my family, our faith is the bedrock of our relationship between each other. And because of that, from early on, we've instilled in our daughter how important it is and how to follow everything that has been taught. And she's able to make her own decisions with that. And she's able to authentically join in the conversation and be able to then bring it to others.
That's huge.
And
Instilling the
lead by example.
values, what your family believes, and talking about those values. Not just assuming this is how it is and you have to do it this way, but talking about the whys behind it so that it becomes their own and they can explore that and argue that or talk about that. That's huge. Having an open place where they can disagree openly and talk about things and then come to their own conclusions to say, this is mine, this is what I believe. That's huge.
Yeah. I think for me, as a very busy individual, just like any one of us here, right? So that you got family, you got work, and then you got community service, all of that. And looking at myself to reevaluate and then self-assessment. I think self-assessment is the beginning of my relationship, how to foster healthy time with my children. And just like many of us here, by the time we get home, we're tired. We're like, listen, go watch TV. Listen, here, your iPad, go and babysitting your own self, right? So I'm a victim of that I
we all are.
make sure that I don't spread myself way too thin, that when I come home, I don't have any more energy to give that intentional time to my child.
Right.
So I think that's where my first thing that I want to do first.
Yeah, we did that this year. We have a high schooler and a middle schooler, and we made a very unpopular decision. We have no video games at all during the week, so they're video game free week. We also were finding our family watching TV during dinner a lot. Like we put it on and it'd be in the background. So we have shifted at Christmas time, and we didn't even make it intentional, but we just started doing it over break and we just haven't stopped. So we have been eating around the table every single night that we can, and no cell phones or anything like that. So talking face to face with each other, which seems simple, but with no TV in the background, and just simple stuff like that. And then not having the video games and stuff on the weeknights, we find that the kids just want to hang out because there's nothing else to do. So they're coming down, they're going to the gym with us to work out, they're going to, as a family, they're wanting to watch movies together, or we're going through a silly sitcom together right now, on Netflix. Yes. But just doing stuff together. We want to play games and stuff together, like board games. But I find that, and then on the weekends, we give them the little more freedom to do those things that they want with their friends online, but at least having some set aside time that they know, and at the beginning they fought us, but now they just know that that's,
Yeah.
it's just, they don't even need to ask because there's no technology.
Please tell my son he's not the only one. But that is huge, because I hear that too. I'm the only one, Mom. But that's huge to have that family time. And it gets so busy. Like, we just had basketball season, and then it's easy to be like, we're eating in the car, we're going here, we're not talking. But just having time to sit down together as a family as often as possible without the distractions of the technology. Really planning technology-free time is huge. But it doesn't just happen. It takes intentionality. And then I like what you said, because we do that too as a family, and I find that it's really fun. We pick a show that we're watching together. Like, sometimes it's something silly on Food Network and a competition that we get into. But we're watching together, and it's still a family activity. So I think that's okay to have technology as long as you're still having those authentic conversations that come from that and the real stuff. Modeling your use. You said it starts with you. Modeling your use of technology. Have times you really put the phone away, that it's not a distraction piece. I think our kids notice that, and they're learning their future behaviors from us. And that's scary to think about sometimes. You don't really think about that. Do as I say, not as I do. That doesn't work. We have to model that and be really intentional. And plan activities with no technology with your family. There's different things. There's links in here that I included. But one of the sheets that you have is just like a fun question thing. For Christmas, I think it was last year, my sister-in-law bought us a little jar and then made these little questions and put that in it. We would use that around the dinner table or things like that. And you might think that's silly because you know your kids. But sometimes their answers, they're evolving and changing too at this age. So their answers might intrigue you, and it might start really interesting conversations. Some are really funny and silly, and there's different ones if you look online for teens or whatever you're looking for. And some that are more faith-based or things like that, depending on what your family wants to do. But this is just conversation starters that you could have. You could make it a game. You could do different things. Taking family walks. That is simple. But how often do we see that anymore? You know, taking a family walk, doing something like that. Planning time with peers that is not centered around technology. All those things, and so many more. You know, we have so many ideas. Is there a comment section on this? Could they put ideas online?
If they want to.
Yeah, put ideas. Share ideas, parents, of what works for you. But it's just finding what works for your family and being really intentional. Sometimes it's stepping out of your comfort zone to do the thing that your child likes to do. Like, I am terrible at basketball, but if I go shoot hoops with my son, he's real excited, you know, also because he wins. But, you know, just fun things. We play Uno as a family a lot. We really like games and things like that. And, you know, it's fun family competition, and then you're communicating, and there's lessons to be learned when you lose, and oh no, they cheated, no they didn't, you know. You're working that out. Those are relationships, you know. We bump, we have conflict, but working that out and connecting is really the main goal. So thank you guys so much for listening today and being part of this.